rackets, and we have 93 million people who are retired, who are of working age that are not retired, but are just not in the workforce. Inflexible, they're running everything, trying to imagine running an entire country through a giant monopolist.
A new silver company for investors, with Keith Neumeyer agreeing to become a major shareholder. Luke Norman, co-founder of Gold Standard Ventures, is the new chairman, and the company has acquired 3 former First Majestic silver properties. To learn more about this must-own silver stock, go to futuremoneytrends.com/silver1. That's futuremoneytrends.com/silver1.
Hello, everyone, and welcome in to crushthestreet.com. I'm Kenneth Amaduri, and I'm joined today with a new guest. He's an economist and the author of the best-selling financial book, The Great Reckoning. And I'm actually going to be interviewing him today on the date that his next book is being released. The Breaking Point, Profit from the Coming Money Cataclysm. His name is James Dale Davidson, and these are some of the things that we've been talking about here at Crush the Street for some time now. His other books, just to let you guys know, include The Sovereign Individual and Blood in the Streets. He's a member of the Newsmax Financial Brain Trust. He's a frequent contributor to Financial Intelligence Report, and he's even appeared on CNBC, Fox Business, CNN, Bloomberg, and major media around the globe. And he's here with me today, so lots to talk about. James Dale Davidson, thanks for joining me.
My pleasure.
James, we're talking about significant change here, as the title of your new book would suggest, The Breaking Point. And you've talked about the U.S. going into a 1930s Great Depression all over again. The mainstream lie over time now is being exposed, and the results of the U.S. presidential election triggered a Treasury bond sell-off, resulting in a corresponding rise in both the 10-year Treasury and 30-year mortgage interest rates. We're seeing that right now. And I saw a chart this morning, which we'll have on the screen here, that this small interest rate hike that has already happened since the election has cut the amount of qualified people who would have been able to refi their house in half. And just this small interest rate hike has had major consequences. And I'll start you off with this. It seems like we are at the breaking point.
I think we are. One of the paradoxes, Kenneth, that many people don't really appreciate is the fact that creating all these trillions out of thin air has also led to the creation of a massive dollar shortage in the world, which seems impossible until you closely examine the dynamics of the funding markets. The biggest source of funding in the world is the Eurodollar market. Eurodollars have nothing to do with the euro currency in Europe. They really are used to signify dollars circulating outside the U.S. banking system. The way it works is we have drained useful collateral out of the system, so an ever greater amount of debt is being perched on a shrinking base of collateral, and this is causing great trouble. Collateral in the Eurodollar market usually is reused or rehypothecated 30 times on average. So it's like having a bunch of gamblers go to Las Vegas with a stack of $100 bills and having them all gamble using that $100 bill stack as collateral. If one of them loses money, eventually the collateral will be seized for the default, and then the whole rest of the thing can't be funded. And that's where we're standing now. We've got $9 trillion that have been borrowed by companies in the emerging markets that normally do not earn dollars. They have to use their local currencies to convert to dollars in order to repay their debt. And this is becoming increasingly difficult because one of the other things that happened when Trump was elected is that the emerging market currencies crashed. In fact, I told my close friends and associates that the way to play the Trump election, which I was sure he would win, was to sell short the Mexican peso, which was a proxy for all the emerging market currencies. And you could have picked up $42,500 overnight for every $1,000 you risked.
Wow.
And one friend of mine who's a billionaire put $250,000 in it.
Wow.
So he's even more of a billionaire than he was. But,
well, James, explain this to people a little more here, because it's confusing, because we've seen the government react to printing lots of dollars since the 2008 crisis. You know, the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve has expanded, all this QE and money printing. It's hard to wrap your mind around why there's a shortage of dollars, but you did explain it. It's that debt has been expanding much faster than new money creation, but I'd like to get your thoughts on that a little more.
Well, let me give you a couple of examples, some of which I've highlighted in the book. The money that was borrowed by these companies in emerging markets was put to use in many cases to increase capacity. And this meant that, for example, in China, between 2011 and 2013, they used more cement than the United States used in the entire 20th century. So people were scouting the world looking for cement, and they dug deeper to find it. They went to more remote places. They had to build railroads in Africa to bring the raw materials to the Chinese. And then they used it to build empty cities. Right now in China, they have the equivalent of 27 empty New York cities, apartment, office spaces that are completely empty.
Wow.
Now, you can't make much money out of an empty New York City. I mean, if somebody said to you, Kenneth, we'll give you New York City as a real estate holding, will you take it? You'd certainly say yes, but then suppose they said, and by the way, we're giving you an empty version of New York City. You have to support all of the overhead costs and the electricity and everything, but there's nobody there. There are no customers. So obviously this is not going to work, and that creates deflation. But the same thing is going on in a financial sense, and this is something that's very hard to see because most people don't know anything about the euro market, the euro dollar market, not the euro currency, the euro dollar. We remember that President Trump has promised that he was going to bring back some of the trillions that were offshore that American companies have earned overseas and have sequestered outside of the United States because they didn't care to pay the world's most punishing corporate tax rate, which they would owe if they brought the money back. So Trump has quite sensibly said, well, we're going to lower taxes and get people to bring this money back and put it to use investing in the United States. So far, so good. It sounds like a good idea. And it is, as far as it goes. But what it overlooks is the fact that the euro dollar market is already suffering from illiquidity. And if you drained trillions of dollars out of it, you would accelerate the collapse of this mountain of trillions of dollars of debt that have been built offshore on U.S. dollar terms.
And how does that trickle into the U.S. here? I mean, is it, you're saying we're essentially screwed either way?
Well, we're screwed in either way because you know what happened. You mentioned some specific data about the number of people who lost the qualification for refinancing due to the interest rate increases that occurred in the markets, not because of Federal Reserve fiat, but because markets backed up interest rates on the expectation that Trump was going to do all these things and achieve all these items that would lead to growth. I don't understand why Wall Street was so opposed to Trump if they think he was such a Superman that he could do all these things. But immediately he got elected, they changed their minds, and now they're totally gung-ho about Trumpflation. But the point is, he's not going to be able to change this whole system because doing what he wants to do to create growth will, in fact, stop it in its tracks. I point out in the breaking point that we've had a sort of regular pattern of recessions or downturns or bubbles bursting at the end of two-term presidencies. And in fact, if you go back to 1912, every time we've had a new president elected to replace an existing president, you've had a collapse. A recession began within 12 months of the new president taking office.
Well, I mean, that's unfortunate because I tend to like Trump as an outsider and doing the things he does to shake up business as usual. And I mean, he's the latest news that he canceled Boeing's latest order to upgrade Air Force One, which would cost the taxpayers more than $4 billion. And him saying no to this, what he's calling basically a rape job to the people. People like that, and it seems like a good shakeup.
I like it.
Yeah. Well, we know, but as you're pointing out, we know he's facing a huge mess in front of him. And one of the things that you said in the book is that the next U.S. president will confront the greatest economic collapse ever faced by the country. And, it's unfortunate that it's going to fall in the lap of someone who is an outsider and seems like he's shaking things up. Your thoughts?
Well, I agree with you, everything you said. I think it is unfortunate. I think Donald will take the burden of the blame because whoever's there when the music stops always gets the credit or the lack of credit for whatever happened. If it's a negative thing, people say, well, it's Trump did it. And, the Federal Reserve is probably going to increase interest rates coming along pretty soon because they were holding off trying to keep the Hillary and the Democrats in power. The Federal Reserve is the last bastion of Democratic Party power in the U.S. institutional framework. The Senate, the House are controlled by Republicans, and Trump will be in the White House in January. So the Federal Reserve has 5 governors, the chairman, vice chairman, and 3 others who were all appointed by Obama. And they generally do what the political winds suggest if they're being very concerned about their jobs, which I don't think they need to be because I doubt any of them will be reappointed. They might try to do what they think Trump wants done, but I think they're more likely to do what Obama wants done. So I think that they will now probably raise rates and they will accelerate the advent of a recession that will be blamed on Trump. So possibly the Democrats can recapture part of the Congress in 2016.
Sure. And it does seem like a very likely scenario. James, one of the themes in your book is that the United States is going the way of the Soviet Union. And I'd like to kind of get your perspective on this and what led you to this conclusion.
Well, I'll tell you, I came to the conclusion that the Soviet Union was going to collapse, Kenneth, in the mid-1980s. And I started talking about it. And I was surprised, I suppose, when Newsweek paid a little bit of attention to my theme and said that it was an unthinking attack on reason. I love that. I thought, well, wow, that's such a ridiculous comment that I've got to frame it and save it. And then on the 25th of December of 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. I was right about it, and I think the reason that I saw it coming down was that we have reached the end. Some years ago, we already reached the end, an inflection point, where growing scale in industry and in the organization of power was counterproductive. We've gone to the point of greatly diminishing returns. The U.S. military, we've heard in the campaign, that our military was eroding and we needed to spend more. We already spend more than every other country combined. How can we not have a powerful military, and why do we need to rebuild it if we're spending more than every other country combined? Well, I think Peter Thiel gave us some hint about it in his speech at the Republican convention when he said that our latest fighter, the F-35, which we're spending $1.5 trillion on, can't fly in the rain. And what the hell is that? That is the most amazing nonsense ever. The North American Air Command, the NORAD, is still using floppy disks. We're spending so much money, more than every other country combined, and we're not doing a very good job of it. If you look at the bombing raids in Syria, it cost the Russians 1/30 of what it costs us to run a bombing mission in Syria.
Wow.
It's one of the reasons that they became much more effective when they got involved. When Russia became involved in bombing the terrorists, they actually bombed the terrorists. We were refusing to bomb the oil convoys that ISIS was sending to Turkey. We didn't do it. The Russians opened fire and blew the things up, and ISIS has been in retreat, at least to some extent, ever since. So we've been amazingly incompetent, and we're spending money, and I point this out in the book, that we have these areas. The military is one where, as I said, we're spending more than every other country combined, and yet we seem to be incapable of making headway in these unbelievably protracted wars. We've been at war in Afghanistan longer than World War I, World War II, the Civil War combined.
Wow.
And we haven't gotten anywhere. We're losing ground in Afghanistan. We have the most expensive medical system in the world, bar none. It's bankrupting people. Obamacare has made it worse. They have, not only are the premium going up so that when you have to pay your Obamacare premium, it goes up dramatically, up to more than 100% in some states in this country. And the deductibles are up to $15,000.
Wow.
A very thoroughgoing survey of household finances showed that 70% of Americans could not come up with $500 in an emergency. So what good is an insurance policy that only works if you've already paid $15,000? It's a complete nonsense. And
we'll wipe you out.
We have, in the United States, one of the worst records of any country, because the third leading cause of death in America is medical malpractice or incompetence by the medical system in some form. So we're spending a lot more than any other country, getting less for it. Look at the educational system. We talk about importing things from China. If we were really smart, we'd be importing high schools and elementary schools from China. There are standard tests which have been applied around the world, and the U.S. came in 27th out of 32 countries. Shanghai, China came in number 1, spending $1,100 per student. We have school districts in the United States that spend 20 times that and get no results. So we're looking at a situation where we have diminishing returns, and all these things that we're spending, they're so costly, they don't work, and this is a sign of the end of the road. It's the breaking point is coming, because at a certain point, people can no longer afford to pay 20 times more than something's worth. Talk about canceling an airplane that's going to cost $4 billion. The whole system is riddled with corruption. It's full of scams and rackets that we're paying for, crony capitalist rackets. And we have 93 million people who are retired, who are of working age, that are not retired, but are just not in the workforce. Do you think all of these people are supported by wealthy relatives?
No.
Not a chance. You're supporting them. And how in the world can you do that? You'd probably have a hard enough time supporting your own family.
Sure.
So we're doing it by spending money out of an empty pocket. We've reached the stage which the Soviet Union reached before we did, because they were more inflexible. They were running everything, trying to imagine running an entire country through a giant monopolistic holding company. Where you have like an electric utility armed with nuclear weapons. Well, that's what the Soviet Union was. It didn't work. And equally, we've reached the stage where we're trying to run everything through this centralized, expensive system is much less effective and efficient than running things at a smaller level.
Sure. James, one of the things that I try to tell people, especially, when trying to break through the leftist mainstream agenda BS, is that you cannot reward non-productive behavior. And that's what we've done for years and years and years. And that's why the U.S. has come down so far over the last 50, 60 years. And other countries have risen up and caught up in many, many cases. And we're reaching that breaking point. I couldn't agree with you more there. One of the things you brought up just now was talking about ISIS and Syria. And I want to get your thoughts on this with Trump, in regards to Trump, him being an outsider and him actually pointing out the fact that the Clinton administration, or Obama administration with Clinton there as Secretary of State, have failed to a large degree, in the Middle East, and, have fought ISIS with one arm tied behind their back, and in many ways enabled ISIS. And I want to get your thoughts here as to how do you think Trump is going to handle the Middle East and, relations with Russia? And, many are concerned about Trump being a hothead and starting nuclear war. Do you believe that?
No, I don't. I think he's much less likely to start nuclear war than Clinton would have been, because she wanted to go in and attack the Russian Air Force in Syria, which sounds to me like a much more likely way to cause World War III than to say to somebody, look, we would like to have good relations with you. Why don't we cooperate in trying to obliterate ISIS, which Russia is all for doing? I think that the biggest key to this whole thing is that you have to remember that most of the policies that would have been followed by Clinton were a continuation of the existing scams. And one of those scams we talked about earlier when you mentioned Trump's promise to cancel this $4 billion upgrade of Air Force One. This so-called deep state, who are the crony capitalists with guns, have been doing what they described during World War I as acting as the merchants of death. They want to create conflicts, and when the Soviet Union collapsed, they lost a big rationale for having huge military budgets, but they found a new one in terrorists, and they've been creating terrorists and inculcating more terrorists around the globe through these absolutely mind-numbing and incompetent military interventions. All you have to do is think about what we did when we went into Iraq, which is the key to the start of ISIS. The U.S. came in, they seized Iraq, and then said to the Iraqi generals, "You're fired. Your pensions are taken away, and you will never again get a job in Iraq. And oh, by the way, you can keep your guns." Huh? I mean, how stupid was that? And if you look at the detail of who runs ISIS, about 100 of Saddam's former generals are the top commanders in ISIS. And they're the ones who personally kept the oil revenues that they got from stealing the oil in Iraq and Syria and running it up in trucks to Turkey, where the son of the Turkish president was helping them launder it. Now, this is true. Iraq was the incubus for ISIS. We created it, and Obama and Hillary Clinton made it even worse. You know what she did in Libya? She was so proud of the fact that she destroyed Gaddafi's regime and replaced it with total chaos and anarchy, with ISIS now having a foothold there, and they're now in 30 countries. I mean, we spread it all over the world. We don't want to win. The military-industrial people do not want to defeat these terrorists, because if they did, there'd be less rationale for spending vast amounts of money for nothing. I mean, just think of it. Even Bernie Sanders was in favor of the F-35 fighter. You know why? Because they've been building these things. They've already purchased hundreds of them, but they don't fly in the rain. They don't fly at night. They have to be retrofitted at great expense, and that's where the 1.5 trillion is coming in. But they put the design center for figuring out what to retrofit and how to do it in Burlington, Vermont. So his constituents were being paid. All but 4 states are involved in the construction of that horrible plane. It's a complete disaster.
Wow.
Totally ridiculous.
Yeah, no, and it's amazing how it corrupt the state, the statists are, the crony capitalists, these companies in bed. And, in terms of the Middle East here, we have a situation where, the petrodollar is, they're trying to keep a hold on the petrodollar. And ISIS is doing us a favor there by creating conflict in the Middle East. And I wonder if Trump is going to be a little more straightforward and uncovering the lies that we've been told for all these years, because he's kind of alluded to it here. But I wonder if how he'll go around, with his political talk in exposing the lies of many, many generations here, at least of many presidents.
Well, I think Donald will, because talking to him, he's certainly not in on the gag. I mean, you only have to remember what he said in the New Hampshire primary when they were talking about 5% unemployment, now down to 4.6 supposedly. He said, only dummies believe that. He said, do you think we'd be having rallies like this if there were 5% unemployment? Absolutely not. It's all a bunch of lies. And this is another strong parallel with the final days of the Soviet Union. Because they were claiming, the month the Soviet Union collapsed, they were claiming 3% growth. But when the music stopped and they looked into it, at the end of the day, after the Soviet Union was gone, they saw that they had a deeper decline than the U.S. had in the Great Depression, and they were just lying about everything. And that's what Obama's been doing. His unemployment numbers are complete fictions. They have an algorithm that they built up during the Reagan days, which is called the birth-death model. You've probably heard of it, right, Kenneth? That's where they say, well, a certain number of companies must have come into existence during this last month, and they created all these new jobs. And maybe some companies went out of business, maybe not, we don't know. So they don't count the companies that are going out of business. And during Obama's entire administration, more companies have gone out of business than were created. But they continue to add thousands of jobs, more than 100,000 jobs every month. They're complete fictions. We just had recent numbers that showed that productivity has been plunging for the last 2 months. Well, guess why? These people who are only statistical figments are not doing the heavy lifting, are they?
Of course.
You create somebody who's just a seasonal adjustment. He's not going to do any work for you. You've got to have real people doing the work. But they've added in so many fictitious jobs in the denominator that the productivity is falling. It's not really a sign that actual productivity is falling, but it wouldn't be a surprise because we're burdening every single person who's doing something that contributes to the sustenance of the country with additional unproductive people who have either given up looking for work, couldn't find work, or are, just straightforward on disability or some entitlement program to find their way.
Sure.
And this is, when then we're creating money out of thin air to fund it.
Yeah.
It can't possibly go on.
James, a strong point you made there with the Soviets claiming 3% growth months before they actually did collapse, and a very, very direct parallel to what we're seeing today in certain aspects with unemployment. One of the things that, and it's a theme in your book here, is squandering the spoils of a good war. And I wanted to kind of conclude on this topic here before we say goodbye. But what is this about here? Squandering the spoils of a good war.
I refer to the period that was known as the Great Prosperity, as so described by F.A. Hayek, the Nobel Prize winner, who was a good friend to me when I was a young man. And what he pointed out was basically that at the end of World War II, you hear sometimes people saying World War II solved the Great Depression and we ought to spend money like they did in World War II. Like Krugman is always talking about, you spend much more money out of an empty pocket, this will make you rich. Wrong. The reason that World War II created prosperity in the United States is that the industrial competition in Germany, France, Britain, right around the world, in Japan, was blasted to smithereens. We were the only people other than the Canadians who still had our economy intact. So we could produce things without competition. And of course, you make a lot of money if you don't have competition. If you read Adam Smith, Ricardo, Karl Marx, anybody you want to, who's at least vaguely an economist, he'll tell you that less competition makes for higher profits. So that is why we had a great situation at the end of World War II, in that we were the only people who had factories that could produce things, and we sold them all over the world. There was a book which I refer to in the book called The American Challenge, which suggested that Americans were going to take over the entire globe, looking at how successful we were in the immediate aftermath of World War II. The average person working for General Motors, which was then the biggest company in the world, was making the equivalent of $50 an hour now, and people could live well. A husband supporting a family on factory wages was not an exception. It was the common experience. And we had this great advantage. We were on the top of the world, and we immediately began to squander it by getting into stupid war in Vietnam, by creating the Great Society and more entitlements. And, right now we're seeing the result of it. Today we have less real income for the median American than his counterpart had in 1973.
Wow. James, I want to ask you one last question here. I know I said that would be the last topic here, but here, one last question. You talk about a lot of lies in the book, and we know the establishment and mainstream narrative is constantly lying to us. But in your opinion, what is the biggest issue Americans are being deceived by here in 2016?
Well, you've got a lot of little and big lies to pick from, Kenneth, but I would say the most decisive lie we have is the idea that we have any substantial economic growth or any growth at all. And I think that part of this is just a methodological lie where we spend a lot of money out of an empty pocket and we count that as growth. This is money that has been borrowed against the future. The government's 43 cents out of every dollar the government spends is either fetched out of thin air by the Federal Reserve or it's borrowed and then it's monetized in some fashion. So there is no real growth. You think of it this way. If you borrowed a lot of money from your father-in-law and spent it, you would not have to pay income tax on the money that you borrowed because it's not really earned. You didn't earn any money. It's not income. It's just debt. So you're running up an obligation to pay back your father-in-law, and you better hope that you stay on good terms with his daughter because you're going to be in big trouble, right? And we're in a situation where we think we've had growth for many years, but I look at a couple of indicators which are much more dependable, which is the energy input in the economy. Today we're using less energy than we used in the year 2000. And this is a sign that our economy has stopped growing in real terms. But we have also created $43 trillion worth of paper wealth that didn't exist in the year 2000, and that's fictitious wealth or wealth that's transitory. That if you have some of that paper wealth, I suggest you convert it into gold in a timely way, because eventually, when the music stops and all the counters are added up, as there was a Kenny Rogers song, I think. There's a time to hold up. There's a time to fold up. A time to count your money and a time to run. So we're getting close to the time to run. And I think people need to be alert to what's really going on. We're being totally misled by the establishment narratives. And we hear all this rubbish about fake news. Most of the fake news is just repeating government handouts and saying what the establishment wants people to believe. If you read the New York Times, you'll be completely confused about and take it seriously, about what's really going on. It's just a bundle of lies. It's like Pravda was in the old days before the Soviet Union went.
Wow. Well, that's some great concluding thoughts there. Everyone, this is James Dale Davidson. His new book out today, The Breaking Point, Profit from the Coming Money Cataclysm. James, any last words you'd like to share with our audience? And we'll be sure to have the book in the description area for people to link to if you do want to pick it up, and I suggest people pick it up. I've had an opportunity to go through it. Great work, and as you all can tell by listening to him, he's a very, very smart guy. So James, any final thoughts here?
Yes, I have this thought, which is that no matter how gloomy I may sound to you, I'm not really gloomy. I think I'm being realistic, but I also know that along with realism, there is opportunity and there's hope. And I give examples at the end of the book of people in the dark ages who made money and became wealthy when they understood the situation they were in and were enterprising. There's always an opening for enterprising people. And I think that the big surprise at the end of the day is going to be that we're probably due for another era of freedom. Not instantly, but a lot of these controls and things that are consequences of big government are going to go away. They won't last forever. And things that don't pay their way eventually can't stand the test of time. And big government basically doesn't pay its way. That's why all around the world, government pensions are bankrupt. They're looking for ways of cutting back on medical insurance and the provision of services that government does, because they don't pay their way. And you have to find new ways of doing things that do support themselves, new little communities or opportunities for survival. If you understand the world you're in, you can make it a much more satisfactory place to live in. So good luck in finding your way and thinking clearly, because the people who don't think clearly or who listen to the crap that you hear from the regular mainstream media are going to be completely gobstruck when the music stops.
Well, I like the way you put that, sir, and I do appreciate you taking the time to come on the show. James Dale Davidson, everyone. Take care, sir.
All the best.